Quentin Tarantino is a director renowned for his knowledge of cinema history, and he's not afraid to share his thoughts on which decades he believes were the worst for movies. In a recent interview, Tarantino cited the 1950s and 1980s as the worst decades for filmmaking and went into complex detail on why he believes this to be the case, wondering exactly what Tarantino meant and why he thinks these decades were the worst. Let's dive in. First, who is Quentin Tarantino? For those who may not be aware, Quentin Tarantino is an American director, producer, and screenwriter who has helmed some of the most iconic and popular films of recent memory. His first feature film, 1992's Reservoir Dogs, instantly put him on the map as a force to be reckoned with in Hollywood. He would go on to cement his reputation with films like Pulp Fiction, Jackie Brown, Kill Bill, and Inglourious Basterds. Talk about famous! Tarantino is also very notable for his extensive use of pop culture references and homages to other films in his work. This has led some to label him as a pastiche artist, which means he draws from a wide variety of sources to create his own unique blend, style, and flavor of cinema. Ultimately, though, Tarantino is just a guy who loves movies. He has spoken at length about his passion for cinema and the way it has shaped his entire life and career. In interviews, Tarantino expressed his belief that cinema is the highest art form and that he considers himself to be a student of film history. Next, why does Tarantino think the 1950s and 1980s were the worst decades for movies? In a recent interview with Joe Rogan, Tarantino doubled down on his belief that the 1950s and 1980s were the worst decades for movies. This may come as a shocker for movie fans and novices alike, as these are generally considered to be two more golden ages of cinema. Tarantino argues, however, that the rise of political correctness and self-censorship in the 1980s led to a decline in creativity and innovation in filmmaking. This stifled the voices of many important filmmakers of the time and resulted in a lot of cookie-cutter, formulaic, and uninspired work. The 1950s, on the other hand, were a different story, according to Tarantino. In the 1950s, Tarantino said that the cultural climate of the time prevented many filmmakers from truly flourishing and expressing themselves. This was because society itself was quite restrictive and conservative. Ultimately, this is fascinating, as Tarantino views both of these decades in a negative light, but for contrasting reasons. On one hand, you have a decade where creativity was stifled by outside forces, and on the other, you have a decade where creativity was stifled from within. It's worth noting that Tarantino himself is no stranger to criticism. His films have been accused of being too violent, misogynistic, and even racist. However, Tarantino has always defended his work, arguing that his films are works of art and that violence is an essential part of the human experience. Secondly, what did Tarantino think of the 1970s? Interestingly, Tarantino had nothing but good things to say about the 70s. He argues that the 1970s were a decade where filmmakers were truly allowed to experiment and push the envelope. This resulted in some groundbreaking films that featured complex and interesting characters, even if they weren't always the heroes of the story. Tarantino says in the 70s you had movies where characters weren't necessarily the hero. They were effed up, but they were interesting characters and you sat down and you followed them, whether it be Travis Bickle or Charlie Rain in Rolling Thunder. They weren't the heroes, and they could die meaninglessly in the end. That was actually considered a commercial ending back in the 70s because it just shows how you can't win. Everything's messed up. You just can't win in America. It's hard to argue with Tarantino's assessment of the 1970s. This was truly a decade where cinema was allowed to be experimental, daring, and subversive. It's no wonder that Tarantino himself is such a big fan of this decade, as many of his films can trace their roots back to the films of this era. One could argue that Tarantino's entire career has been a love letter to the films of the 1970s. From the non-linear storytelling of Pulp Fiction to the use of pop songs as a narrative device in Jackie Brown, Tarantino has always been heavily influenced by this decade of cinema. Okay, does Tarantino's assessment of the 1950s and 1980s hold up? As viewers who love movies, it's always interesting to hear Tarantino's thoughts on cinema history. That being said, it's important to take his opinions with a grain of salt. After all, Tarantino is just one person with his own unique perspective. It's also worth noting that Tarantino is a filmmaker who often pays tribute to and borrows from other films. So in a way, his assessment of the 1950s and 1980s may be a case of sour grapes. After all, if these decades were truly as bad as he claims, then how did he manage to become such a successful filmmaker? That being said, it's hard to deny that the 1950s and 1980s were somewhat less creative and innovative than other decades. This is likely due to the political and cultural climates of the time. So while Tarantino may be overstating things a bit, there's no denying that these were difficult difficult decades for filmmakers. What were Tarantino's criticisms of the commercial films of the 1980s? In his interview with Joe Rogan, Tarantino also had some harsh words for the commercial films of the 1980s. He claims that these films were cynical and that they featured uninteresting, one-dimensional characters. Tarantino argues that everything was cynical, then all of a sudden in the 80s, all that was washed away, and the most important thing about a character was that they were likable. Every character had to be likable and the audience had to like everybody. This is a valid criticism of many commercial films of the 1980s. However, it's important to remember that not all films from this era are bad. In fact, there are many great films from the 1980s, even if they do tend to be more formulaic and commercial than films from other decades. So is controversy surrounding Tarantino's work warranted? As mentioned earlier, Tarantino's films have often been accused of being too violent, misogynistic, and even racist. However, Tarantino has always defended his work, arguing that his films are works of art and that violence is an essential part of the human experience. It's worth noting that Tarantino's films often feature strong and complex female characters. In fact, many of his films could be classified as feminist, even if they do feature some controversial and violent content. It's also important to remember that Tarantino is a director who often pays tribute to and borrows from other films. So in a way, his films can be seen as love letters to the films that have inspired him. Ultimately, it's up to each viewer to decide whether or not they enjoy Tarantino's films. However, it's important to remember that his films are works of art and that they should be judged as such. Each viewer will have their own opinion on whether or not Tarantino's films are too violent, misogynistic, or racist. And this ultimately is the beauty of films and art in general. Everyone can have their own opinion and interpretation. Next, what are some of Tarantino's top choices of films? As a certified cinephile, Quentin Tarantino has strong opinions on which films he believes are the best. In a recent interview, Tarantino listed Top Gun: Maverick, Toy Story 3, Apocalypse Now, and even The Bad News Bears as some of his top choices of films. Tarantino's love of cinema is evident in everything he does. This is definitely shown by his incredibly vast choice of films, ranging from Top Gun, a movie filled with epic scenes of pilots, aircraft, and shootouts, to Toy Story 3, a heartwarming Pixar film about the bond between a boy and his toys. What's clear is that Tarantino loves movies, and he wants everyone to love them as much as he does. Because of this, it's really hard for anyone to argue with his selections. Whether you love or hate Tarantino's films, there's no denying that he knows cinema better than almost anyone else, having studied and lived cinema for his entire life. This is what makes his opinions so valuable. They come from a place of genuine love and appreciation for the art form. And at the end of the day, isn't that what cinema is all about? Finally, what's the takeaway? While you might either agree or disagree that the 1950s and 1980s were the worst decades for movies, there's no denying that Tarantino's opinion is an interesting one. It's also worth noting that his criticism of the commercial films of the 1980s is quite valid. There's no question that when films become more commercial, more focused on making money than actually displaying the art of film, they seem more plastic and surface level. This is definitely a perversion of filmmaking, and it's just up to us as to what we think about that. At the end of the day, though, cinema is about the individual and individual appreciation. On that note, which decades do you think were the worst for movies? Do you agree or disagree with Tarantino's thoughts on the matter? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and subscribe if you haven't already.